Director for the National Center for Cultural Competence, and an exciting new initiative and an opportunity that she's working on is the Leadership Institute for Cultural Diversity and Cultural and Linguistic Competence, a catalyst for change networks supporting individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities. On a personal note, I over the last 7 years or so, I really got to know TAWARA, and she's been such a great mentor for me in this field, between the Multicultural Council and really just encouraging me to continue on with my work here. And so thank you, and we are so happy that you're here. Please join me in welcoming TAWARA.
Good afternoon, everyone. How are you? Good afternoon. Maybe you had food in your mouth. I'll give you a chance to swallow, and I'll try it again. Good afternoon, everyone. How are you?
Great.
I'm very pleased to be here in sunny Arizona. When I left yesterday, it was snowing. So I'm very pleased to be here, and also just to have the honor, the distinct honor of presenting at this conference. I've known about the conference for a number of years, and as the commissioner indicated, this is one of the only conferences that really is looking at issues pertaining to African Americans and disabilities at a statewide level. And I want to commend all of the planners, all of the presenters, and anyone who had anything to do with this conference. I give you, I applaud your efforts. So I was asked to talk about cultural competence and linguistic competence, and in particular focus on what are the implications for that for African Americans. And to be honest, I really struggled with putting this presentation together to see what's going to be meaningful to share with you in such a short period of time, and to also put some of the challenges on the table in a very authentic way. So I came up with these objectives I'd like to share with you, that we are going to define the multiple dimensions of culture and how they apply to African Americans and Blacks. And while the focus may be on African American and Blacks, because that is the theme of this meeting, I really want you to think about how these aspects of culture impact other populations as well. We're going to describe a framework for a cultural competence model. We will summarize disparities impacting African American populations, and also cite the implication of the isms, and that's a broad range of isms, on services for individuals who are African American and Black. So those are my general objectives. We're going to go ahead and get started. It's very difficult to talk about cultural competence without really defining what is culture. And so we're going to spend just a few minutes getting us to really think about the multiple dimensions of culture. There are many definitions of culture, and I want to share with you one of the definitions that we use at the National Center for Cultural Competence. We believe that culture is a learned and shared knowledge of specific groups. It tells us how we behave. And when I say that it's learned and shared knowledge, is that we begin to teach children, infants, as a matter of fact, culture at birth. We teach children what it means to be a girl, or what it means to be a boy, or what it means to live within this particular family, or within this particular setting, so that we begin to infiltrate individuals about culture from the very beginning. Culture includes all of the things that are listed on this slide in the ovals, and quite simply some that could not fit there. And so that we know that culture applies to a racial group, an ethnic group, a religious group, a social group, a political group, a professional group, many, many, many different groups. That what's very interesting about culture is that culture is transmitted from generation to generation. So that there are things that people do, whether it's birth rituals or naming rights or baptisms, you name it, that they pass down from generation to generation. So just as some things remain the same, there are other aspects of culture that are constantly changing. They're quite dynamic. And yesterday I had the privilege of talking with Phil's group, and I gave the example of how culture changes so significantly in the area of technology. That the language changes, what you do with the devices changes, how things are generated. And that's a very, I'm going to say, up-to-date way to think about that. I know that someone here is tweeting because she said that she's tweeting a conference. I have never tweeted in my life. However, there's still hope for me. You know, I may be able to do that. But again, that is the changes in our technology, changes our culture, how we behave, how we interact, and how we communicate. And so, again, it's really important for us to think about culture in this way. We know that culture is applicable to everyone. Oftentimes, people may think about culture and confuse it with race and ethnicity. And so as we think about culture and the definition we had about culture, it means that we are all cultural beings. All of us, we really are cultural beings. And that we know that culture is value-laden and is rooted in our belief systems. We know that culture is active and dynamic, as we talked about before, but also that culture is multi-layered. Sometimes we use an analogy of an onion, like peeling back the layers of the onion, and you go deeper and deeper. We also think about culture as being conscious and unconscious, so that there are many things about our own culture that we don't even think about. It's like living there, underneath the surface. And sometimes it's not triggered until you encounter a culture that's different than your own. So again, for us to really think about culture in this way, we can believe that culture is thick, thin, and compartmentalized, and that's something that we see in the literature. So perhaps when we think about someone who may be very thick in a culture, and being from the East Coast, I'll give an example of perhaps an Amish community. And I saw a woman in the last session who's from Lancaster, and this will be very familiar to you. So as we think about that culture, that there are specific rules, there's specific ways in which people dress, there's specific ways in which males and females interact, there's specific ways around food, and so that is the culture. And it doesn't matter if, say, for instance, someone from that family visited Las Vegas, that their cultural expressions would remain the same. And so that's what we may call very thick in the culture. When we think about folks that may be thin in the culture, it means that there may be certain aspects of their culture that would be important. Say, for instance, it may be baptisms or it may be naming rituals. That is very, very thin aspect of their culture. And last, we think about compartmentalized. This means that we demonstrate different aspects of our culture within different settings. So today you see professional TAWARA representing Georgetown University. Tomorrow, when I fly home, you might not even recognize me. Because that's not the role, that is not the identity that I indeed need to be able to project. And so, again, I want us to really think about culture in terms of it permeates every aspect of our life. This is another take on culture, and I call it multiple cultural identities. And again, this was written well within the literature. And this graph here is not, it's not a real graph, it's something I created. That is to give you an idea about how our cultural identities may mean different things to us in different times. So that sometimes the importance of my cultural identity may be my race or ethnicity, but then other times it may indeed be my gender, or at other times it may be my profession. And for some people it may indeed be a disability. But all of these help define who we are, so that we all have multiple cultural identities. And I think, again, that's really very important. So that when we hear individuals talk about services to African American people, it puts things in a box. As Aaron said earlier, as if all African American people or Black people are alike. So we have to really look at the experience of individuals and their multiple cultural identities in the design and delivery of any services and supports. I want to share with you this slide. It's quite busy. And I will walk you through the slide. I call it Convergence of Cultural Contexts, and then with a focus on disability. In the middle, there is a circle that says an individual with a disability. The very next circle is the family. And so as we think about the individual with a disability, we think about that person's cultural identity and or identities. It may or may not be the same cultural identity that will be shared by members of his or her family, particularly if no one within the family has a disability. So again, that's within a cultural context. Then you look at that within the cultural context of the community in which that individual and family resides. Because there's indeed a cultural context there. It's in a very lively session, listening session with the commissioner and staff just in the last session. And we're talking a lot about African Americans and African American communities. And so again, we have to consider that. Next is looking at the social political environment, which is really very important. I've been to communities, and I'm not naming Arizona, it's just some communities where there's been strong anti-immigrant sentiment and other issues that have taken place. And so that impacts that individual with a disability, their family and community altogether. Then if we look at what's surrounding these concentric circles, you can look at the healthcare system, the vocational rehabilitation system, and early intervention system, the healthcare system. You can look at, again, developmental disability service systems. Each and every one of these systems has its own culture. If we go back and think about how we define culture, that it has its own policies, it has its own rules, has its own language, has ways in which people interact within that system. So if we go back to the concentric circle and look at the person with a disability and or his or her family, and say that they have to navigate only 4 of those different systems, just think about how challenging that would be. So that means I have to learn the rules in this system, I have to learn the language in this system, which may not be compatible with another system. And so for us to really think about culture and its depth and its complexity, and how culture is not just rooted in the individual, but how it impacts each and every one of the service systems that's here in Arizona, serving people with disabilities, children with special health needs overall. So again, it's helping us to think about culture and its complexity and its depth. So there are several summary statements, and I just call them rules. And if we look at rule number 1, that we have to have a solid appreciation for and understanding of culture. And I'm going to repeat that. A solid appreciation for and understanding of culture within the context of delivery services to people with disabilities across lifespan and across racial and ethnic and cultural groups. And so as we think about diversity, I wanted to share this with you. Sometimes I play a guessing game with this, but we weren't going to have enough time to be able to do it. So I went about looking at who lives in Arizona, what's the demographic makeup. And so if we look at the top 10 countries of birth for legal permanent residents in Arizona in the year 2013, that's the year for which we have the most recent data. And as indicated here, there are significant numbers of people, and quite frankly, many different countries of origin. And so I want to make sure we're all on the same page about legal permanent resident. Again, it's a government term, and it's looking at people who have, quote, legal status in this country to be able to work, to go to school, to go to college, to own property, and actually to also serve in the military. And so if we look at year 2013, these are the groups of people that we see that were granted legal permanent resident status in the single year of 2013. And if you look, and these groups may be really very familiar to you, but as I looked, I thought, really? Burma? Really? Bhutan? I mean, Arizona? Really? I mean, this was indeed my reaction. And so as we look at this degree of diversity, and this is, again, just in one single year, and folks may be spread throughout the state, it tells us a lot about groups of people. And somebody say, well, why are we talking about this when this theme is really African Americans? We're talking about this because we're not just talking about African Americans receiving services, there's also the capacity of African Americans and blacks to deliver services to the diverse populations within the state. So that we're not looking at it in a one-way perspective, we definitely are looking at it in both ways. So if we look at population by race in Arizona, as you see here, in terms of total population, is just under 6.5 million. And again, looking at how people self-identify in the census. I want to call your attention to the categories of some other race. That's just under 500,000 people. And then 2 or more races. In other words, this is how people are self-identifying. And so if we look at that in greater detail, again in Arizona, when we look at that, I looked at it specifically for African Americans and Blacks in terms of how people self-identify. We look at individuals who identified as white and Black or African American at 37,000 people. But then also we have Black and African American and American Indian and Alaska Native at 5,000 people. So again, it's looking at how do people self-identify, what do they call their own racial and ethnic identity. And then lastly, it was also very interesting in looking at these data, and again, these are all the categories, race alone or in combination with one or more other races, that Black or African American were at 325,000 compared to 270 that indicated just one race alone. And so as we think about who constitutes the Black and or African American community, at least from the data that we collected, it is quite diverse. So I wanted to pose the question, how do Black and African American populations self-identify? And at least according to our census data, that these are categories that are offered, that you can self-identify as being Black or African American alone as a single race. But then as you continue to look down, including in the state of Arizona, people self-identify as Black or African American and American Indian and Alaska Native, Black or African American and Asian, Black or African American and Native Hawaiian or other Pacific Islander, Black or African American and some other race, white and Black or African American. We also have people who self-identify as 3 or more races, and lastly, individuals who may self-identify as Hispanic or Latino. Okay, self-identify as Hispanic or Latino, but they can be of any race, including African American or Black. And I share these data with you because I think they're very important, so that we don't forget, as we talk about, quote, African Americans and this large umbrella, that we recognize the many within-group differences among people who self-identify as African American or Black. I want to share with you just also for you to think about cultural factors that influence diversity among individuals and groups. Time precludes me going through all of these. I will selectively take a couple to be able to share with you. But as you think about, these are all of the factors that influence people in terms of how they self-identify and diversity. And while my emphasis today may be on African Americans and Blacks, that you can look at this and think about any particular racial group or cultural group in the U.S., in tribal communities, and in territories. My first one is looking at cultural, racial, and ethnic identity. And oftentimes people use these terms interchangeably. I'm not saying all the learned people here in this room would do that, but there have been audiences in which people do use these terms interchangeably. And as I, again, always share, in particular, in terms of explaining this, is I have a colleague who really invented this framework for thinking about diversity. His name is James Mason, and he's out of Portland, Oregon. And he was speaking to a group that was not as racially and ethnically diverse as this group. And as he spoke about issues pertaining to African Americans, he looked at the one woman in the room who was Black. And he did that periodically throughout the session. On break, she came up to him and said, "Hey, Dr. Mason, I appreciate your personal attention, but I'm Panamanian and I mean it." And he had made an assumption about this woman based on how she looked. Indeed, she was Black. However, her country of origin is Panama. She self-identified as Black Latina. Her language was different, customs very different, music, food, you name it, really very different. But he made an assumption, he knew something about her just based on how she looked. So it's very important for us to differentiate cultural identity from racial identity and ethnic identity. And while they may be interrelated, they are not the same. And it's really key and critical for us to focus on that. And that again acknowledges the within-group differences among people who may self-identify as Black and African American in this country. I think that we can't overlook tribal and clan affiliation, particularly being here in Arizona, and that there are many, many things here that help us think about diversity among individuals and groups, including beliefs about disability and mental health, what it means within certain communities, and also what the lived experience of having a disability may be in terms of mental illness as well. So as we think about these many different factors to help us really look at the within-group differences among people who self-identify as Black and African American. So it's not just you check the box and that tells you who a person is, but these are many considerations that we have to have in terms of designing services supports that will be labeled culturally and or linguistically competent. I want to share this quote with you. It's from a book from a colleague, and I think it's pretty powerful. And it looks at views on disability identity, because we also often talk about, quote, the disability community as if it's one community. And again, without recognizing the within-group differences among people who experience disabilities, and not necessarily limited to the disability in and of itself. And so the population of people who experience disability is extraordinarily diverse, and therefore the idea of a common disability identity isolates disability artificially from intersecting identities related to race, to gender, sexuality, class, age, and other axes of social significance. Now you can tell an academic wrote that. However, it has great power. And what it's saying to me at least, and hopefully it's saying to you, is that we place so much emphasis on disability that we forget about all the other identities that people indeed may have. And that those identities may take precedence over, quote, the disability identity at any given situation at any given time. And so that we just can't make assumptions about this common identity that people indeed may share. So they may share it, but the experience may be very different because I'm a woman, or very different because I'm an African American woman, or very different because I may be gay. So it's really key and critical, again, that we really pay attention to culture in its depth and in its complexity. And so as we think about that, again, looking at the diversity within Arizona, we usually collect data on every state that we're providing training in. And this is some data that we put together for the state of Alaska, and again, of Arizona. I got cold with snow on my mind. And 2013. And again, if you look at the categories and the percentages of people who speak languages other than English, and I think this is very important for us to attend to, because oftentimes when there's a predominant population in the state, say at least here in Arizona, it may be Hispanic Latino population, then there's a great emphasis on Spanish and or some other variations that people may speak. I would say that people who fall into languages that are least frequently spoken get overlooked. And so it's key and critical as you think about services and supports that you design that we are clearly aware of what the demographic trends are in terms of people who speak languages other than English. And again, we looked at data in terms of Arizona. This is looking at limited English-speaking households. And it's a term that's coined by the census that used to be called linguistic isolation. And I think this is really significant when we think about services and supports here in Arizona, that 4.6% of households, again, this is an estimate, as good as an estimate, have members in it that have linguistic isolation. And that means that no member in a household 14 years and over speaks English or speaks a non-English language and speaks English very well. That is significant. So as you think about community engagement, you think about the work that you were doing with and on behalf of people with disabilities, that attending to language is going to be very key and critical. And so if you look at the percentages, while 18.3% for Spanish, the next category down is Asian Pacific Island languages, and that's 20.7. So what does that mean in terms of services and supports here? Most importantly, what are those languages spoken, and how are staff across racial and ethnic groups here in Arizona prepared to address those in the delivery of services and supports? So, rule number 2, that diversity, so we think about diversity, is not limited to race, ethnicity, and disability. There are many other parameters and aspects there are many different aspects of cultural diversity that we need to be attending to overall. So that was my quick way of looking at culture and really trying to look at culture and cultural diversity within the state. Now I'm going to share with you a definition of cultural competence. There are many reasons that we need to address cultural and linguistic competence in the work that we do serving people with disabilities and their families. And I've just named 5 that are here. I'm sure that you can come up with many more. We can look at the demographic changes in the United States as territories and in tribal communities. I know earlier today we looked at those changing demographics. We know in 2018 we would look at youth under 18 years of age that would be, as it would say, predominantly majority minority. Now, only in the United States could you have a majority that somehow got named a minority, but that's beside the point. But that's what we'll be seeing overall. We also know, in terms of reasons to address cultural and linguistic competence, is diversity in worldviews and belief about what it means to be healthy, what it means to have be healthy, both physically and mentally healthy, what it means to have disability or chronic illness, so that all of these are influenced by culture, as we talked about before. We know that cultural competence can improve the quality and effectiveness of services and supports. While this is very well documented in mental health literature and also health literature, the disability literature is pretty far behind. We don't have the same level of research that has been measuring and looking at the impact of culturally and linguistically competent services within the sector. There's federal and state legislation, and Aaron, Commissioner, talked about that before, and there's also regulatory and accreditation mandates. There are many states in which, in order to practice, that professionals indeed have to show within their licensing and credentialing that they've had courses as it relates to cultural and linguistic competence. So we've seen that across the country in at least 4 states, not in Arizona, but in other states across the country. And then lastly, we know that cultural and linguistic competence is very effective in terms of addressing racial, ethnic, linguistic, socioeconomic, and geographic disparities. Now, these are just some of the reasons to think about why we should indeed address cultural and linguistic competence in disability services. In one of the policy briefs, I just wanted to write that it's the right thing to do. My colleagues wouldn't let me do it, said it wasn't evidence-based, it was solely opinionated. So if we think about a conceptual framework for cultural competence that I'm going to share with you. This is based on the work of Terry Cross, Barbara Bacheron, Carl Dennis, and Marisa Isaacs, and James Mason, whose name does not appear on his original monograph. And this work was done in 1989 in child and adolescent mental health. So those here in the mental health community may be very familiar with the Cross model. These individuals were doing work at that time at our center at Georgetown University, and they kept saying that all children weren't served well within state systems for children with at-risk or with mental health conditions. And so they came up with a framework, and I can say that it's been used extensively across the United States. When we did a paper on evidence base for cultural and linguistic competence in 2007, 2006 for the Commonwealth Fund, we saw this framework and definition mentioned just across the board. And I think that's not by coincidence. I think that this particular framework is universally applicable across multiple systems of services and supports. So let's look at defining cultural competence. I want you to think about what this means within your respective programs, and or if you are receiving services and or a parent of a child receiving services, to think about what that means within your family. We look at cultural competence, first of all, as having defined values. So that is very values-based. When we think about the same thing with disability services, we know that in terms of cultural competence, that there has to be congruency in terms of the policies, structures, behaviors, and practices that we see within an organization or system that will enable that organization, that system, that agency to work effectively cross-culturally. And it doesn't say cross-racially or ethnically, it says cross-culturally, so that we're looking at the kind of cultural factors that we talked about earlier. There are 5 elements of cultural competence at an individual level, and I want you to think about the extent to which you may practice these elements within your particular setting. The first one is being able to acknowledge cultural differences. Sometimes people are uncomfortable acknowledging cultural differences. They feel they may not be able to do that in a politically correct way, or they may think that it's rude for some reason. Since we're all cultural beings, and we're all cultural beings, that we should be able to honestly acknowledge that there are cultural differences. There's no value placed on differences. It just means that everybody is not the same. So that is a very important element of cultural competence at the individual level. The second is being able to understand your own culture. It's really difficult to talk about understanding the culture of others when you don't have a good grasp of your own culture. And that may mean your culture from your family of origin. It may also mean the culture of the discipline in which you've been trained, the culture of the organization for which you work. And then again, me being in Arizona, it's very different here in terms of things being laid out in a different way, the kinds of things that I see, how people dress, how people interact, but really being able to understand culture in that way. So understanding your own culture. The third element is being able to engage in self-assessment. And I asked this yesterday, how many people here have had an opportunity to engage in a cultural competence self-assessment at all? Raise your hand. Okay. This is an essential element of cultural competence, and it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to do this with a tool or an instrument, although there are many tools and instruments that are available. But sometimes you may have an encounter with someone and it doesn't quite go well. And you may go back and reflect to say, what happened there? You know, were there some cultural differences in interpretations about that particular situation? So it's also being able to engage in self-reflection. So self-assessment is a key element of cultural competence. And we've developed any number of tools that are available on our website for doing just that. And in particular for people providing services to individuals with disabilities and their families. The fourth element of cultural competence is being able to acquire cultural knowledge and skills. That means that it's intentional. That means that you make it a priority to learn about people, A, that you're serving, to learn about people who maybe and think and act differently than you do, and that you go about this in a very systemic way. So again, we're looking at what you do at the individual level. And lastly is being able to view behavior within a cultural context. No matter how strange your behavior may seem to you, it may be perfectly, quote, normal and reasonable to me. And so it's really important that we use that lens when we're looking at others to whom we're providing services and supports. Quickly, looking at the 5 elements of cultural competence at the organizational level, and for you to think about your own respective organizations. First of all, organizations have to value diversity. Many organizations say that. Their websites show all these different photos of people who are from diverse groups. You may see it in brochures, you may see it on walls, but you do not see that great degree of diversity in the hierarchy of those organizations in terms of who's leading, nor on the board. So as we think about valuing diversity, it's those elements of diversity that we said, that it's throughout the organization. You know, it's not at this end and never at this end, but it's throughout the entire organization in terms of being able to value diversity, and that being reflected in how services and supports are delivered. The second is being able to conduct self-assessment. That means, have any of your organizations conducted an organizational assessment of cultural and linguistic competence? Please raise your hand. You can't raise them high, so good. Okay. All right, thank you. So, conduct self-assessment. This is also really very critical. It looks at how you're serving diverse groups, and there are many tools that you can do that. The National Center for Cultural Competence has a tool that's available on the website, and it's called Cultural Linguistic Competence Assessment for Disability Organizations. It's there, you can download it, and it also has a guide. What we say about conducting self-assessment is to be able to look at how you are serving diverse groups at any given point in time. And what's important about this process is looking at yourselves, but also gauging the experience of people who are receiving the services. And so again, in looking at conducting self-assessment, we advise that you look at it in terms of areas of strength, but we never say weakness or deficits. We found that that's insulting to many people, and it simply isn't necessary. We refrain and talk about areas for growth, because we all can grow in this work that we do together. The third is managing the dynamics of difference. That means that not only the differences that you may see between provider and individual receiving services, but also among the staff and within communities. And so that there has to be a way in which organizations systematically address difference overall. So that's another key element of cultural competence at organizational level. Lastly, well, the fourth is looking at institutionalizing cultural knowledge. And I know that many people are sensitive to that word, institutionalize. I have kept that word in because that's the word that came with the original model. However, when we look at what that really means, it is the capacity of an organization to indeed have it integrated and embedded, ways in which they pass on knowledge about serving diverse groups to anyone who may indeed work within an organization, including volunteers who also represent those organizations. So institutionalizing cultural knowledge is key and important. As we look at the next one, and that is being able to adapt to diversity. So that means that organizations indeed have to be able to change what they do, review their policies and procedures, to look to see, am I current based on what's going on in the literature, based on what's going on in terms of the populations, and also going on what's best in terms of best and promising practices. So these are the 5 elements of cultural competence that will be very important at an organizational level, and I'm moving along pretty quickly just because of time. We feel that the elements that I just shared with you have to be present at every level of an organization, from the policy-making level down to the community level. And I suggest to you, it's very difficult to be a culturally competent counselor in an organization that does not support you with policies, procedures, and resources. So if we're moving toward cultural competence as an organization, you're hitting each and every one of these levels. I would dare say what we see nationally is a big focus on what individuals do, which is important. But individuals don't run organizations. Individuals typically at that level don't make policy decisions, and they certainly don't develop budgets. And so as we think about cultural competence, it has to have involvement of each of these levels. We believe that cultural competence occurs along the continuum, as you see here, from cultural destructiveness to cultural proficiency. What's important about this is not labeling an individual organization culturally incompetent. It's about recognizing that you're at different spaces of time with different groups of people, so that you can be able to focus on what's the next level that I need to be able to achieve. It may be really great with urban settings, not so good in rural settings. Maybe excellent with young people, not so good in terms of serving seniors. And so again, being able to critically look at your organizations and your practices is very important. I shared this yesterday, and it's from a young gentleman that I met in Texas when we were doing training. And he gave his perspective of what it means in terms of cultural competence and linguistic competence. And basically, from his perspective, he indicated that cultural competence and linguistic competence were the services I need from a perspective I can relate to, in a language I'm comfortable with, and at a location I can get to. I thought that was very powerful, and it hits all of the things that we've been talking about in terms of his perspective, his own cultural perspective, and the language I'm comfortable with. That could be English, but it also could be looking at issues like health literacy. and how information is conveyed. And then at a location I can get to, meaning that it's accessible. So, rule number 3, that we have to recognize, respect, and respond to the within-group differences among all people who experience disabilities in their families. As we think about the disparities and inequities that may be impacting African American populations, we know from the literature that there are disparities and disproportionality in education, health and mental health care, employment, housing, and in social services. And so as we think about this work, I would be remiss if I gave this presentation and did not talk about the elephant in the room. And I create most of my slides, and as I was looking for an elephant to put in this slide, I had a hard time finding an elephant that looked serious. All of the elephants were like cutesy or something like that, and then I found this elephant, and I don't know, his or her eyes give up a little serious look. But we have to address the isms if we're truly addressing cultural competence. And there are a number of isms that are labeled here in terms of the table. I'd like to just share with you some very unique things as they relate to African Americans. This is from a book chapter that's yet to be published, but it should be coming out fairly soon. One of the things that we have to think about is looking at the social fabric of the U.S. and its influence on our cultural views of intellectual disability. It is a topic that some within the disability professions are uncomfortable or reticent to discuss. There's a well-documented history of belief systems and practices that consider blacks and African Americans as intellectually inferior to non-Hispanic white populations. Regrettably, this historical context, combined with contemporary experiences, continue to have far-reaching implications for African American children and families, and manifest in a number of ways. The legacy and ongoing impact of these belief systems are most apparent in the overrepresentation of African American students diagnosed with intellectual disability, or considered to be, quote, slow learners in the past, and the disproportionality of African American students in special education settings, specifically for intellectual disability, behavioral and emotional disorders, learning disabilities, and those diagnosed with language delays and disorders based on the fact that they use African American vernacular English, and sometimes referred to as Black English. In addition to African Americans, recent research documents that Latino children who have limited English proficiency or English language learners also are disproportionately assigned to special education. A complex array of dynamics contribute to this pattern of disparate treatment that includes, but is not limited to, stereotyping, conscious and unconscious biases among educators, culturally biased assessment instruments and practices, discrimination, institutional and structural racism, and the debilitating effects of students of color living in marginalized and disadvantaged families and communities. It is essential that professionals have an understanding of these historical, cultural factors and their impact on current realities facing people with intellectual disability from racially and ethnically diverse groups across the lifespan. In today's workforce, a professional's capacity to respond to cultural and linguistic differences among people who experience intellectual and other developmental disabilities is an essential knowledge and area of skill. And I say that because, again, we have to deal with the elephant on the table, and we can't ignore it. So as we think about cultural barriers to access and services supports within African American communities and other communities, there's historical mistrust of healthcare professionals. There's also that people who may come to the U.S. that may be from countries, other countries that have Black populations, they're unfamiliar with services and supports offered in the U.S. Again, the experience of racism, discrimination, and bias. And again, cultural beliefs about what it means to have a disability. There's stigma, there's issue of literacy and health literacy, and limited English proficiency. How are the systems in Arizona addressing these barriers for care? How are you collecting data about it? And how are you making differences in how the way services are designed and included? And so as we talk about this, this is a very important area of literature is in terms of bias. As we think about bias, people think about bias in a negative way, but simply bias in and of itself is neutral. It really is one preference for one thing over another. Like, I like vanilla ice cream, and I don't have vanilla ice cream anytime over, I don't know, some other flavors such as strawberry. We know that we all have biases, and bias only becomes a concern when it becomes a prejudice against certain people and in ways that may be destructive. So I want to share with you a video.
As an African American social worker, you can imagine my dismay when I discovered that my results from the implicit association test on race revealed a bias against African Americans. Well, actually, no one is immune from bias, whether it's in reference to race or ethnicity or weight or geographic location. We all are receiving messages that influence us. I, as a child of the segregated South, certainly heard messages all through my childhood and even into my adulthood now that devalue African Americans. And my parents, oh, they tried. They highlighted the role of education for success, but even that with a sense of urgency. And no matter how much they praised me, I always wondered whether or not they were telling the truth. Well, this clearly has affected me in my practice as I've gone through the years. This sense of self-doubt, type of internalized suppression has haunted me. But as I do my work, I try to kind of marshal up that strengths-based orientation with my African American clients, but at times I will slip into a rescue mode, kind of sinking into that frame of rescuing them from what may be a confirmed deficit. There are many ways in which in-group bias shows itself. Some of the things that I've witnessed come out like, you're an embarrassment to the race, or I made it, why can't you? Or they'll never get it. I don't even know why I bother to provide direction or guidance. These are the kinds of things that one can see with in-group bias. Now, Lillian Gomez and Jacobson both tried to give us a foretelling of these issues in their 1991 article on transference and countertransference in the interpersonal dyad. They talked about these issues related to distancing, to anger, to colluding with an us against them modality. All of these things can be problematic in service delivery. Clearly, we all have to deal with issues of bias, whether it's in group or out of group.
So I am out of time, and I'm going to zip through just a couple of things. These are some thoughts about culture and key considerations for you. You are a cultural being and have multiple cultural identities, one of which may be your professional discipline or position in a school, a university, a clinic, a community-based organization, or government entity. You view and interpret the world through your own cultural lens. That we all have biases, and I won't go into any detail about that. But your worldview or your cultural frame of reference influences your approach to delivering services and supports and other responsibilities associated with your role or position. And then your willingness and capacity to address cultural misunderstandings are essential to supporting people with intellectual and other disabilities and their families, working in relationships with colleagues and others. And so I'm going to end on this one. This is from Multnomah County Department of Health. They decided that they needed to improve cultural competence, that they weren't serving all groups well. And this used to say it's a culturally competent manager. We asked permission to use this because I think it's very powerful. So This sums up, I think, my entire presentation in a very eloquent way. As a culturally competent, you fill in the blank, I'm capable of interacting positively with people who do not look like, talk like, move like, think like, believe like, live like, act like, love like me. And as I look at this, I want to call attention to move like. I changed this in 2005 at the request of a gentleman who used a wheelchair for primary mobility. He said he loved to quote, but he didn't see himself represented, and asked could I put move like me there, and I did. And 2 years ago, I changed it again at the request of a student from Georgetown University who said, could you put love like me? Because that's also very important. And so I leave you with this thought about cultural competence and linguistic competence that it is essential to all services and supports that are delivered to and on behalf of people with disabilities and their families across the lifespan. Thank you.
Thank you, Tawara. I just want to take a quick second we really want to acknowledge our key sponsor and major contributor, the Black Legacy Endowment Foundation. It's allowed us to have this great lunch, and for all of you here, so we just want to say thank you so much. And we're going to have a very quick special presentation. Dr. Ann Hart, retired Arizona Department of Education Deputy Associate Superintendent. She's going to give a brief special presentation to honor one of our benefactors, one of our good, great community members here.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. Nice to see you again this year. We have some dynamic educators and professionals in the state, and those of you who are visiting, we do. And we also have educators, or who I would like to call unsung heroes, who've done so much for the field of education professionally, interestingly, motivating students for years and years and years. And sometimes those educators get up in age and there are challenges that prevent them from being here to acknowledge their personal award. But one person I would like to introduce to some and make aware to others who know this wonderful woman is Miss Jean Fairfax. And on behalf of today's, we would like to acknowledge her on behalf of the 4th Annual African American Symposium on Disabilities. We present this award to Ms. Jean Fairfax in recognition of her continuous commitment and contribution to the advancement of disability rights. We're going to present her this award in absentia. We'll have Robin Coulon. If you're here, would you please come up and accept this wonderful, auspicious award? And as she arrives in the podium here, Ms. Jean Fairfax, a warm round of thanks. Thank you. Robin's going to accept this award. Thank you, Robin. And just know that this award is presented today, Friday, the 27th of February, 2015, by David Carey from the Arizona Bridge to Independent Living, and Rinaldo Fowler, Arizona Center for Disability Law. This is an awesome award to be able to present David and Rinaldo to Ms. Jean Fairfax, who awesomely deserves this award. Thank you for accepting this award.